All right, welcome back, everybody, to another great episode here on Learn or Be Learned. Today's guest is Jake Stahl, and without further ado, I'll have Jake introduce himself, and I'm really excited to jump into some amazing topics. Jake, thank you so much for being here.
Sure, Shiva, thanks for having me. My name is Jake Stahl. I'm a fractional chief learning officer. I've been doing training and development for 30 years through numerous countries and 47 of the 50 states in the US. And I have a degree in psychology with certifications in neuro-linguistic programming.
Yeah, so let's start there because that's where I'm curious. What exactly is neuro-linguistic programming for those that may not be too sure?
Absolutely. So NLP is really kind of old. It's been around for a while. And what it is the ability to understand not only the way people process information, but the way they make decisions. So, how do they frame things that they hear? What modality do they listen with? Are they primarily visual or auditory or kinesthetic? And then it talks about how associated you are with feelings and what feelings you're dissociated with. And Shiva, believe it or not, it makes for the classic, not only counseling technique or coaching technique, but it makes for a great sales technique. It allows you to understand a person on a much different level and help
Hmm.
them change the way they frame things or think about things. I know going through the coursework myself to get a master certification was a game changer for me because it helped me get in touch with things I never really thought about.
Right. I actually interestingly enough, now that you say that, I had an episode that I recently published about understanding the modalities of learning, which I think not a lot of people truly know. And
Agreed.
personally, for me, it was, and this came from just stumbling upon it myself. And I wish I had known this earlier, but I realized for me, I'm more of an auditory learner, which is
Right.
why when I sit down and just reread textbooks, sometimes my mind will just wander off. But an audible book or one of these audibles or whatever, right? The ebooks that you just listen to, I can listen to it on 2x speed and be fine, which I thought when we were growing up, I thought everybody could do that. So then,
Right.
right.
Yeah.
So then, literally one day, I'm eating lunch a few years ago when I was living with my parents, and my dad walks by and I'm watching YouTube on like 2x speed. And he goes, "How do you even hear anything? What are you doing?" he's like, listen to it like a normal person. And I'm like, what do you mean? I was like, I thought everybody does this, right? And that's when
Right.
I started slowly stumbled into this idea that there's different modalities for learning, and when you understand which one you're best at, which and I'm sure you can go into this a little bit more than me, but from my understanding, I think there's a predominant one that you choose, and then one that's maybe a secondary learning modality that you're also keen to versus like out of the three, correct? So for me, it's
Yeah, you're dead
auditory and
on,
then
Shiva. And
kinesthetic. Uh-huh.
I'm not sure we choose it. I
Mhm.
think it's kind of the way we're brought up and the way we prefer to assimilate information. And for your audience, if you ever want to find out what modalities people use, it's actually pretty simple. You can ask a significant other, a parent, or a best friend. Just say, close your eyes. You go into a field and there's a tree.
Mhm.
Describe it to me in as much detail as possible. And what
Hmm.
you find happens is people will use primarily one modality, one's probably secondary, and then the third one may be almost non existent. But the important thing to remember, Shiva, is that that can change based on the scenario. So
Hmm.
I may have a spot where I'm extremely visual, but when I listen to my favorite songs, I connect into that audio side of what I like. So a visual thing may be what I need for business, but I may need something more audio to stir an emotion. So knowing the
Interesting.
modalities is a peek into the window, but understanding how that window shifts perspective is really what NLP is all about.
So you're saying that in different environments, the modality might change.
It may. Now,
right?
you're
So,
always
for
going to have
example,
your
you said
primary
business.
one. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Shiv. I apologize.
Oh, no, no, you're good. I think we have a slight connection issue, but no worries. You were saying, uh, so we do have a predominant one, but it can change based on the environment of which what we're learning.
Correct. And not only that, but different modalities can stir different things. For instance, the sense of smell or your smell modality, I guess we'd call it, is the one that really doesn't go through any process in the brain. It doesn't get processed before it hits like an emotional center for you. And this is why if we have the scent of a person or we catch a waft of something in the mall, it can stir such great memories. Or conversely, it could store poor memories. Uh, but when I'm in business, it may be that I need to see something to believe it. And if I listen back
Mm,
through my podcast, Shiv, or I listen back to talks I've given, I'm primarily visual. But that doesn't mean that there aren't times where auditory takes the stage for me.
right. So now let's say someone has tried the tree method and they figure out what their predominant learning style is. How, maybe the next question people are wondering is, how is that beneficial? Why does this matter to me? Right? Because, for example, I think the issue is most people don't even know that there is a difference, because I've brought this up
Right.
too to other people and they were genuinely had no idea, because we're
Yeah.
all brought the same way through the school system, right? Read this, learn this way, solve the math problem in this manner. The freedom of expression is limited, so people don't actually always know that there is different learning methods. So let's say someone has now figured out that this is their learning method. What are some benefits and how do you capitalize on that now with that new knowledge?
I apologize, you froze. So, what are some of the benefits?
Yeah, so what can someone do with that newfound knowledge with, with their learning style?
Yeah, and here's where it gets exciting. So, the first thing I think we need to do to put this into context is remember what everybody's favorite topic is:
Hmm.
themselves, right? We all like to talk about us, and there's
Right.
nothing wrong with that. It's not a judgment call. I'm not trying to slam anybody. It's just the way it is. We like to talk about ourselves. So, I think we can make the rational leap that if ourselves is our favorite topic, we tend to get drawn to people who are like us. And we tend to like people who are like us. So
Hmm.
if I can mirror someone's modality, so if I hear somebody is primarily visual and I start to mirror that back to them, we start to form a connection. And the connection is the foundation of trust, right? If we
Hmm.
form that connection, we're hoping that there's a trust that builds out of that. So by mirroring someone else's modality, you make yourselves like them a little bit more. And since they like people who are like themselves, and that's who we tend to associate with, it starts to really build on itself. So the more I can mirror you, audio wise, visual wise, same tilt of the head, same posture, the more we connect on really a subliminal level.
Hmm. So, for example, maybe if you're trying to mirror someone who's predominantly auditory, you might mimic their cadence or the pitch of which they're speaking. Would that be an example versus kinesthetic is body movement?
It would be. And
Hmm.
even if you mirror the terms or get them to think in that way. So, Shiva, if you say, I really want this podcast to go well, and I know your auditory, I can say, what does a great podcast sound like to you?
Hmm.
What
Right.
do you hear when you're talking to the other person? Because it's going to force you to shift into the modality you're most comfortable with.
Hmm.
The hardest part about NLP and about mirroring other people and what they do is you really need to shift out of your modality and get into theirs. And that's something that takes practice and
Mm,
time, but the payoff is beyond words. The payoff is huge. This is what public speakers do to an audience, it's what trainers do to the participants. It's what a good salesperson or persuader does with the other person. So it's an art.
right. So how does this apply when there's a mass audience where people have different, modalities that they prefer, right? So public speaking, for example, do we hit all three? What's the move there?
Outstanding question. And the great thing about public speaking is it's really a forum for storytelling. And I think it's
Mm,
been shown time and time again that public speakers with the best stories are typically the ones received with the most favor by the audience. So if I can cover those different modalities while I'm talking to the audience, I can bring in the see, hear, and feel. It makes a huge difference. So if I'm talking about this tree scenario and I want to describe the tree to an audience, I can say, God, the leaves were a beautiful green, and man, the yellow of the wheat in the meadow was gorgeous. I even heard the wind going through the leaves, and I think there was a babbling brook I heard in the background. But what was nice was when I felt the tree, the bark was a little rough, not enough to cut me, and the grass, it was softer than normal, maybe a bluegrass. So you weave those components into your story so every modality can go, I feel you. I got it.
mm. Yeah, that makes the most sense. And I think storytelling also uses a lot of it, when you can connect all three, it truly builds the story, right? You hit all context of details and you make it as vivid as possible for people to be grasped to what you're saying. I think that's a important key. But my mind also is curious as to what is neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. Is that mainly for communication? Do we use it in any other contexts?
Well, I think some of it's in communication, but some of it may be in other modes of communication. It could be marketing, it could be sales, it could be talking one on one. But even when you write an email, NLP can be used because it's much deeper than just modalities. It's speaking in metaphors, it's
Hmm.
understanding the way the other person thinks and what they associate with the most and maybe disassociate with. So I've actually helped companies with their email marketing campaigns where they were dropping out thousands of emails and getting a low response rate. And just by clicking or changing the subject line or something in the body to make it more applicable to a person's base psychology, we've made a huge difference. So NLP is, if you take like the basic practitioner approach, you learn some basics, but when you go master practitioner, it just goes a lot deeper into what people look for in a message or a communication of any kind.
Hmm. And when we say neuro-linguistic programming, right? Neuro makes sense. We're talking about the mind, the brain, linguistics, language, and programming. Are we talking about the programming of others or the programming of ourselves? Because I'm curious.
I've never looked into that, Shiva, but I think it would, in my mind, it indicates how I'm programmed. So, what
Hmm.
is my neuro linguistic programming? We all have that kind of BIOS, right? That base operating system we work with,
Hmm.
and that's what I think of when I think of the programming side. Not that I'm programming you; it's how does my programming affect my communication, and more importantly, how does it affect the way I hear you when you communicate?
Hmm. And you touched on this a little earlier, but is this based on how we're raised or how we're born or a mix of both?
It's a great question, and I am not going to pretend to know that answer. But if you look back in psychology, the nature versus nurture
Hmm.
argument has been happening, I think, since people could ask the question. And I
Right.
think that's probably for greater minds than my own. I don't know
Hmm.
the answer to that.
Hmm. But but from your studies, have you seen the effect of environment? As we kind of talked about, I guess that makes sense, right? Because you said different environments produce a different preference in modality sometimes. So I guess environment definitely does have a play here in the conversation.
Yeah, and I could understand. So let's look at the two. So if we
Uh-huh.
look at nature, um, maybe we've been forced into a modality. Maybe we have some sort of deficiency in one area. Maybe our hearing isn't that great, or our visual acuity isn't that good. So, or maybe we're raised in an environment where sight is super important. So if I'm raised somewhere where I have to be on the lookout all the time for danger, my visual modality may increase and become my
Right.
predominant. Where auditory, it could be maybe I'm raised by a concert pianist. So
Mm-hmm.
my modality that increases would be my auditory acuity. So I think there could be an argument that we're either raised a certain way that promotes one, or we may get it by the way we're nurtured or by our own physical, not even just limitations, but areas where we may be exceptional.
Right. So I always struggled when growing up through school. There was only one subject I truly struggled in, which was reading comprehension. And that was mainly because my mind would wander as I read the text. And
Right.
and as much as I practiced, it was just something I just could not somehow get the better of. So
Yeah.
that leads me to ask, can you strengthen your weakness in one of the modalities, or is it you should play into your strengths?
Well, I think that's going to depend partly on age, right? So, how long have we relied on this modality? I'm a
Hmm.
firm believer that you can change it if you really want to, but I think it depends on where you are in your life, because NLP teaches you that our brain goes through different phases as we get older. So, when you're in your teens, you're focused on this. When you're in your 20s, you're focused on this. 30s, 40s, 50s. So I think depending on where you are in life will depend on how easily you can change it.
Hmm.
But the one thing it does say, NLP pretty clearly, is that when we make a decision, we tend to make better decisions when we involve all modalities versus only using our preferred one. And a great
Hmm.
exercise your listeners can try on your own is think about a decision that just completely went off the rails. And to this day, you think to yourself, how did I even get there? And think about the modalities you use to make that decision. And what you may find is that you used one primary and ignored the other two. And I'll give you a great example. I made a rough decision about 20 years ago that to this day is a little tough. And when I think back on it, I used auditory as my decision making
Right.
almost exclusively.
Hmm.
And I'm a visual person. So I
Right.
ignored one modality. And looking back on it now, I think I never saw what was really obviously right in front of me. So I think there's a huge benefit to learning a new modality or trying to strengthen the others, if not for decision making, but strictly to broaden your communication horizon.
So you're saying when making a big decision, we can and should use all the modalities in NLP?
I'm saying that it may be beneficial for you to entertain all modalities of this.
Hmm.
And this is great if, let's say, I'm deciding tomorrow I'm buying a new car. I may walk up to the car and think, oh my God, this car sounds great. And I can hear the people telling me, hey, you got a great new car. And I can hear
Right.
the ad in my head saying it's great to buy this brand. So I do that. But later on, maybe I have buyer's remorse and I think, wow, I didn't look at that real well. And I didn't take into consideration the sticker price. And
Right.
kinesthetically, the seats aren't real comfortable. And oh, I can see
Right.
now that that color is going to get super hot in the sun. So I think the consensus would be the more modalities we can involve in a decision is going to give us perhaps a more well rounded and better thought out decision.
So let's take the car example then. I think
Yep.
that'd be a great um, segue. I can. can we go through that as an example, how we would
Yeah,
use
sure. Yeah,
each
let's do it.
modality?
Yeah,
So you're saying, okay, I'm on the market for a new car. Obviously, I want something great, something, expensive, something nice. That's what we gravitate towards, right? So you're looking
right.
at it, you see this amazing car. Obviously, the dealers are trying to sell you on it. Um, what would be the thought process for the auditory modality when viewing this car?
Well, part of it is listening to what other people think, because undoubtedly, when you're going to buy a new car, you're telling everybody, "Do I look at a car today?
Yeah.
Specifically, looking at this brand, and what do you
Mm-hmm.
think? What do you drive?"
Mm,
And so, part of it would certainly be listening to other people's input, and maybe even testimonials if they drive the exact same car. Another may be, how does the engine sound? How does it sound when it's on the road? Are the tires loud? Are they soft? So you may take all that into account. Visually, what does a price tag look like? How does the dealership appeal to me? Does it look like it'd be a good place to buy from? Is the
mm,
car aesthetically pleasing inside and out? Then you get into kinesiology, which is the third of kind of the big three. We call it the VAK. So you get into kinesiology and you think, wow, this seat feels good. Air conditioner works great. Seat heats
right.
up when it's supposed to. So
Drives nice.
yeah, taking all
Yeah.
those in. But Shiv, on the other side, if you hear somebody that bought a car spur of the moment or was like on the dealership and the salesman convinced them, ask them how they made that decision. And a lot of times you'll hear one modality with a hint of another one, but
Mm,
no third. And it's
right.
kind of the mode we shift into because it's the one we're most familiar with.
Interesting. So that makes perfect sense. But what about an example such as you're thinking about switching jobs, right? So auditory makes sense still in this case. What about visual and kinesthetic? How do you apply that in that kind of example in a decision
Well,
making?
you may not be able to apply kinesthetic always to certain things, except maybe to feel if you're in the moment and you're grounded. One
Mm,
exercise we talk about in neuro-linguistic programming is take a moment to center yourself and feel everything around you. How do you feel on the seat? How's gravity feel pulling you down? Is it cool or hot in the room? Is your clothing feeling right? Think about how it feels on your skin. So, a lot of times you can use one of the modalities to center and to become back in the moment.
and we're
And
talking about the present moment or the moment you're in that decision.
either,
Okay. Okay.
whatever works for you.
Hmm.
And this is a great way too, Shiv, and that was an excellent question, is I think all of us in the middle of the night, we tend to get those little gremlins that come out. It's 4 in the morning, you're wide awake, your mind's racing.
Right.
Uh, Going through the modalities is a great way to recenter and get those out of your head. If
Hmm.
you have your eyes closed and your mind's racing, look around. What color's the wall? Do I have a ceiling fan? Is it spinning? What else do I see in the room? Are there any smells in the air? Is my dog
Mm.
in here? Is there a muss to the bed sheets? Is it paint going on? What do I hear? Do I hear the ceiling fan? Do I hear a car outside? So a lot of times pulling in the modalities not only help you make a decision, but also help you recenter when your brain has, for lack of a professional term, gone off the rails at 3 a.m.
Right. And honestly, Jake, this sounds a lot like meditation to some extent.
I
And in
hope
some instances, right, when you're observing your surroundings and such. Have you made the comparison or done any research in the parallel of meditation and NLP?
I have not, because my mind tends to race like you with reading something.
Uh-huh.
If I have to sit and be quiet, my mind goes down a million rabbit holes. So
Mm-hmm.
I've never pursued meditation because I wasn't sure if it would be successful.
Mm-hmm.
But practicing the NLP, looking at all my senses at 4 in the morning, I do that all the time.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Does it and I think this is an interesting segue, right? Because you talk about the can't fall asleep at 3 a.m. You're listening to all your modalities. this segues into this idea of anxiety, right? Because you also
Right.
look at the idea of anxiety and you've researched that. And I'm guessing there is a parallel between the two, or are these just different
Yes.
research that you've looked at?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, if you read into it, and we won't have time to go into it here because it's a little in depth, but there's called
Hmm.
an NLP phobia cure, where you
Hmm.
can walk somebody through a 15, 20-minute exercise, and the goal is to alleviate them of a phobia. And it
Hmm.
all depends on your practitioner and the willingness of the participant. But yeah, phobias are big anxieties. I'm afraid to go out in public, be in crowded spaces. So, yeah, NLP does have suggestions for those. I hate to say a cure or a solution because I think that depends on a variety of factors, but
Hmm.
it does have suggestions and exercises you can go through to alleviate anxiety and things such as phobias.
Right. And what differentiates this idea of a phobia versus just a fear, right? Because many people have fear of public speaking, but I'm guessing phobia of public speaking is maybe an extreme version.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever thought about, and I love how detailed you are. I don't know if I've ever thought about the exact definition of the two. And I think if you put together a Venn diagram, there would certainly be an
Yeah,
overlap at some spot. Because I think there's a difference between having an anxiety about having a spider near you
right.
and actually jumping up on the sofa screaming and, not going on the floor again.
Right, right.
But yeah, I think that's an excellent question on your part. And frankly, I'm probably going to look that up later.
Yeah, I mean to think about it, there's got to be something that differentiates it towards the extreme, right? I
Yeah,
think
I
a
would agree.
fear, right? Fear maybe can be um, somewhat resolved through triumphs and personal, you know, push through versus, or maybe some assistance. But it sounds like NLP helps for more of the extreme case where you truly are almost paralyzed from the idea of, or maybe that has a hint of what to do with it, right? Maybe it's a paralysis of your inability to look at the modalities, and that's kind of what NLP is bringing back.
Yeah, and it does treat anxiety as well because we all have kind of, again, we go back to this BIOS or our operating system that we work with. And part of that does create anxiety for us. And anxieties tend to build over a long period of time. Usually, a phobia is like from some sort of traumatic event or something
Hmm.
that triggers our brain to think it's a traumatic event. But there's also a lot of different NLP exercises to get through that anxiety inducing thing that you have, whether it's dating or cleaning the house or new business development, whatever it is. There's a multiple set of exercises an NLP practitioner can take you through to help you get by those things.
Hmm. And what tips would you recommend for the listeners right now that maybe suffer with anxiety in some realm of their life? Maybe it's starting starting some project they're thinking about doing, or maybe it's writing a book, right? There's because sometimes anxiety can create procrastination
Yep.
from reaching your goals because maybe it's the dissonance between what you want to do and the fear of doing it. What do you think?
Part of it is getting to what the root cause is.
Hmm.
A great example that I always use when we talk about things like this is weight loss.
Hmm.
Everybody says, I need to lose 20 pounds. I
Right.
would argue, Shiva, nobody on the history of the planet has ever wanted to lose weight. And yet you always hear it. I want to lose weight. No, you don't. There's something deeper that's causing this.
Hmm.
So a lot of times when I get down to the root cause with people, it's I'm having trouble getting up off the floor when I play with my granddaughter. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my partner, so I need to look better at the beach. So usually what I do, at least with clients, is when you have something that you're anxious about, and let's use a writing the book example,
Hmm.
it is literally, well, I shouldn't say that. I've yet to come across a time where the anxiety was about the writing or the book.
Yeah.
It could be, I'm afraid it's going to be a flop, or I don't know how to write. And a lot of times it starts with a simple exercise of what does this look 3 layers down?
Mm,
I'm anxious about writing today. Why is that? Well, I'm afraid that I won't do well and I don't write well. Well, why is that? Well, when I was a kid, I got an F on a grammar paper.
hmm.
And why was that? It's because at home we never really focused on it. So a lot of
Yeah.
times the anxiety goes down to a much deeper level. And if we treat that and we speak to it, it tends to come back to the thing we're in the present
Mm,
and alleviate that. So anybody who's having anxiety over something like that, do a thoughtful exercise of digging 4 or 5 layers down and be honest with yourself. Nobody else is in the room. It's just you and a piece of paper. Write it out.
mm,
What is it at the core that is causing this surface level anxiety? And what you
right.
often discover, and what I discovered when I did it for myself, was it had nothing to do with writing or the book.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the discoveries made through NLP can be fascinating. It can make you laugh, and it'll most certainly make you cry because you'll get in touch with some stuff you didn't realize was there.
Right. It sounds like using this onion layer method of saying why a couple times can kind of get you to that deeper level because and I've done this certainly myself is you have a superficial reason, right? It's
Right,
oh, I'm
exactly.
tired or it's I don't know how to write a book, right? Or just something
Yeah.
superficial you give yourself that maybe your subconscious is trying to protect and that's where the anxiety stems from and I think when you say the why is 3 or 4 layers deep, you get to the root cause. But I'm assuming that also just takes a lot of practice, right? Because someone who's not used to it probably still holds up resistance or blocks from getting there.
Yeah, and that's another thing NLP does is it helps you identify those blocks and get by them. But Shiva, this requires like agonizing honesty. I mean, even the
Yeah,
honesty you don't want to tell yourself, it requires. And that's why a
right.
lot of times an NLP practitioner with you can help you get there.
Hmm.
Um, and sometimes by ourselves, we're not even willing to admit our weaknesses to ourselves, and I'm included. I mean,
Hmm.
it's hard looking at yourself and taking a super critical view because even you don't want to see you at its rawest form.
Right. But I think one of the most beautiful things you can do is have or build that self awareness
Yeah.
of truly, everything that's behind the curtain, which, like you said, can make you cry. It can be agonizing because we tend to run from the things that make us uncomfortable, which is probably where some anxiety stems from in the first place.
Or we medicate it.
Mm, right. Or escapism behaviors.
Exactly.
Right, right.
Yeah. And let's face it, Shiv, it's normal. Our brain has a hardwired fight or flight thing going on.
Hmm.
So if we aren't allowed to fight or flight, we tend to look for the quickest and easiest way to get through it. And that can be drugs. I apologize. And that
Yeah,
can be
no worries.
drugs. That
Hmm.
can be alcohol. It can be any addiction.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying everybody who has anxiety gets an addiction. Please don't interpret it that way. But I think in our search for wanting to get away from those raw emotions, we tend to look for the quickest escape.
Right. In a way, we sedate what's trying to come to the surface, right?
Yeah.
Does that so and I'm guessing the longer you do that, the harder it gets to bring it back up to the surface, right? Because you're pushing it and pushing it and pushing it down.
It gets easier to deny.
Hmm.
And it enables you to not really need to look for another solution. Hey, at the end of the day, I have a couple of beers and the problem's gone. So
Right.
tomorrow, all I need to do is get through the day to those couple of beers again and we'll be good. And listen, I'm not faulting anybody. I've gone through
Yeah.
addictions of my own and it's an easy way out. And I don't blame anybody for taking it's a
Hmm.
real struggle to face up to the raw you.
Yeah. Right. And I think as cliche as it is, that saying that people say the first step is knowing that you have a problem with whatever you're dealing with is
Yeah.
almost as true as it can be in this case, right? Because that's the first step to digging through to the layers.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And that's hard because it's not only admitting it to yourself, but most programs tell you now you need to admit it to others to get it out in the open.
Hmm.
And both are equally terrifying.
Right. So I also wanted to ask you about, you had something on your bio called conversational learning dynamics.
Hmm.
Is that truly what NLP is, or is that like a branch? I'm just trying to understand what that is.
Well, conversational dynamics is something that kind of a term that I coined. I'm sure everybody else has done this at some point, so it may be completely unoriginal. But I think conversational dynamics talks about your ability to adapt in a conversation.
Gotcha.
So as you and I are talking, I get to feel for what your modality is, and I get to feel what your likes
Right.
and dislikes are and what your triggers are.
Hmm.
So the dynamics of a conversation are you talking just to be heard? And are you listening just to talk again?
Hmm.
Or are you actively in the conversation? And this was the foundation of the 210 rule that I came up with is how do you stay in a conversation when our mind's tendency is to just shoot off elsewhere? How do
Right.
we stay with that laser accuracy? And it's not easy. But if you do stay with that accuracy and you have the ability to evolve as that other person is talking, literally second by second, the relationship and the communication, the value of it goes up exponentially. And here's
Right.
a good example. When was the last time your phone rang and you looked at the phone and you looked at the phone number and went, oh my God, I just don't have time for this person. And every
Right.
one of your listeners has that person in their head right now. They
Right.
have the picture, the name, everything. That person you don't have dynamics with. But
Hmm.
when you have a great podcast show, or you get promoted at work, or you buy the new car, who's the person you call? That's the
Right.
person you have the dynamics with. So my approach is how do we get to be that way with just about anybody? And that's how the conversational dynamics was born. It's a blend of psychology and neuro-linguistic programming to form a conversational blueprint.
Right. And part of it is maybe some of the things we talked about, right? Mirroring people with NLP. I'm assuming, like you said, laser focus on listening to what they're saying is, I'm assuming it's a skill or, you know, quote unquote, a muscle that you could say that you're building, right? That you
Yeah.
can build upon and get better with. But it's interesting that you say all that because I resonate in a parallel way when I mentioned the reading. That's where my mind wanders, and I'm better at tuning in and listening, which is why I probably prefer podcasting as opposed to being a writer, writing blogs or a book, right? And I've even
Yeah.
had conversations with the NLP with, although I didn't know it was NLP, I had conversations with friends in the past and we were talking about our learning modalities and I was telling them, well, you guys are probably predominantly kinesthetic learners, which makes sense because you gravitated towards, martial arts and bodybuilding. And, they thought for a second, like, wow, that makes a lot of sense because I do prefer the hands-on approach to learning things, or I prefer for me, auditory, right? So podcast makes perfect sense. So I think it's so interesting how once you also understand yourself in that level of awareness, you can kind of play into your strengths on where you fit in, almost like the ikigai concept.
Yeah. No, I
Hmm.
agree with you 100%. And if you want to build those other areas, you can start a hobby that
Mm,
emphasizes those other things. If you're not kinesthetic, maybe you do something where you work with clay or you do origami, something that gets that kinesthetic part of you involved to as you said it, to build your muscle.
right. And even going one step further, what I find interesting is since I was a kid, I've been fairly good at drawing. But now that I think about it, I cannot draw just on the spot. Like if I have a blank page and I'm thinking of something, I cannot draw it. But if you give me an image, I can almost draw it perfectly, which kind of shows more of a kinesthetic side versus a visual side, right?
Right.
So I
Yep.
find that very interesting. The more you dissect who you are from your past experiences, I think you'll get more clear answers.
Yeah. And kind of harkening back to what we said earlier, it's that self introspection and your ability to be honest with yourself
Yeah.
that opens all those doors. And those are the hardest things, right?
Hmm.
Nobody likes to say they're wrong. And yet that's part of the process of being able to say it. When you get used to saying you're wrong and you're not right very open, God, that's like the most freeing day of your life.
Right.
Because being right all the time is an effort and it's a
Hmm.
control thing and it causes stress.
Hmm. And you said your predominant modality is visual.
Yes.
Okay. And how does that apply to your daily life? Has you have you noticed as you're an NLP practitioner and you help people, and how does that apply?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it is I'm very focused on body language. So I'm partially focused on what I'm hearing, but
Hmm.
80% of communication is body language. So for
Right.
me, the visual aspect is super important. You know,
Hmm.
NLP teaches you, depending on which direction a person's looking when they're talking to you, they're accessing different areas of memory, modality, etc. So for me, the visual acuity is super important. Now, listen, I love to listen to music and I get very emotional with songs and it makes my day to listen to stuff, but it's the visual that matters to me the most. And it's funny because the people closest to me know this. You know, I'll say to them, "Oh, it looks like you're stressed." It's like, "How do you know that?" It's like, "Well, your eye kind of twitches when you get in that stress scenario." And I'm like, "How
Yeah.
do you pick that crap up?" And it's
Right.
just because that's my preferred modality. I like the detail of it.
That's so interesting because the same concept, but you would hear me say, "You sound stressed," or "You seem
Right,
stressed," right?
exactly. There
Right.
you go.
For
Yeah,
you, it's you pick up on the visual acuity, and for me, maybe it's a tonality switch or a hesitancy there.
exactly.
Interesting. That's
It's
yeah.
fascinating when you get deep into it. But again, NLP is also a rabbit hole. Is okay, so how much can I solve with this? And you know,
Right.
when does it cross over into needing therapy versus just a good NLP practitioner? So I think there's a lot of gray lines there,
Right.
but all of those lead back to how honest can you be with yourself? And one of the number one complaints psychologists tend to have is the patient's just not being open with me.
Right. That's
So
fair.
it all boils down to how open can you be with yourself, and then further, how willing are you to share that?
Hmm. And so, since you pick up mainly on body language here, I watched a lecture last year at one of the Tony Robbins conferences, and it was this woman talking about body language and analyzing people's behaviors. And I found that very interesting because she was saying the things that you were saying, right? When your eyes go to the left, you're processing something different versus to the right. When somebody's, touching their chin, they're thinking in a certain way. And she was saying all these things, and she even said, she's worked with FBI agents and stuff. So like this is real stuff that people use to
Yep.
understand human behavior and thought processes. So, it's I'm curious, what are some things common things that you pick up on people that are behavioral things that behavioral psychology, um, mannerisms.
Sure. And thank you for asking. This is I love this stuff, and this is what I'm really passionate about. But let me preface this by saying that a good, solid NLP practitioner will tell you none of this is 100%.
Yeah,
There's
right,
sometimes touching the nose is an itch on the nose. There's sometimes looking up to the left is just looking up to the left.
right. Or some
So
people have an eye twitch naturally or something.
correct. So it's
Right,
important to understand that none of this is 100%.
right.
But one of the first things you're taught to look for in NLP is the visual distinction of the eyes. Where are the eyes going? So you know how they're processing.
Hmm.
If their eyes are level and they're going side to side, that means they're accessing their auditory. If they're looking up to the left or up to the right, they're accessing their visual.
Hmm.
So you can see, is somebody seeing that memory, or are they talking about something they can see in their head but they didn't really see in real life? Same thing with ears. Is it something they actually heard, or is it something they imagine they heard? Like,
Right.
what does a tuba sound like falling downhill? You don't really know. You've never heard one falling downhill, but your eyes tell you, are you searching for the fact that you did hear one, or the fact that you can imagine what one sounds like? And
Right.
that leads into some great conversations right there. So if somebody says to me, "Oh my God, I do this all the time and I've seen this 100 times," but their visual, their eyes are telling me they're creating this memory as they talk,
Hmm.
it may be one of many cues that tells me that may not be 100% accurate.
Hmm.
Again, it doesn't say you're a liar, but
Right.
it's one of the many puzzle pieces you put together. And
Hmm.
that can be with, if I touch my neck or I kind of touch my face or my mouth, it's usually because I'm guarded and I'm self-soothing and I'm trying to hold back from either being nervous or saying something. So I would say, in my opinion, and I'm nowhere near the level of the speaker you talk to, uh, but I would say that body language is a puzzle. You gather 10 or 20 pieces from everything they're doing, and you kind of form an opinion
Mm.
as to what you think may be happening.
Right.
Um, I can't think of any one specific body language thing that's like 100% marker, 100% correct all the
Right.
time.
I've noticed one distinct one is when you're talking to somebody, if their feet is often turned away, they have maybe they have somewhere to be or they're done with the conversation. I've noticed that to be fairly true most of the time, because if someone's planted in your direction, they're willing to have the conversation. But if their feet's kind of planted away, they maybe they're in an urgent need to leave, or maybe they're just not interested in the conversation. But have you noticed that one?
Yeah, and that's a great one for if you're like working a room.
Yeah.
So if you go into a group of people that are talking, and if all the feet are centered, pointed right into the center, or all the knees are, if you're all, sitting with each
Hmm.
other, it's usually some sort of involvement. But you will inevitably catch people where their feet and their knees are telling you they'd rather be somewhere else than where they are right
Right.
now. So yeah, I'm a big believer in those cues. And I'm also a believer in trust cues. Psychologists have put together, 3 traits that if you have them in a picture, people are more likely to trust you just by looking at your picture. So I think
Hmm.
there's some things that are universal,
Yeah.
and I think there are others that are need to be lumped in with a bunch of other things that before you can get an accurate assessment.
Right. I know one big one is hands, right? So if you're speaking and you put your hands behind your back, to some extent it can make somebody possibly uncomfortable, because subconsciously we look at that as a threat, because we're like, well, what's behind your
Yeah,
hands, right?
what's in your
Versus
hands?
right. Versus
Yeah,
when your hands are out or open, it shows like welcome, it feels more welcoming, versus
yeah,
like this, or kind of like that, it's like a closed posture.
yeah, yeah. Very true.
Hmm. And I think this applies very well to public speaking, because especially since I started this podcast, there was things I didn't realize in the way I speak and in the way I am visually, right? So for example, when I first started the podcast, I had a lot more ums and fillers, and visually perhaps maybe I was a little bit more closed off, or you start to notice those things, which I find very interesting too.
Yeah, it's you always hear in a poker game that somebody has a tell.
Uh-huh.
We all have 20 or 30 tells,
That's so
and it's
interesting.
just up to us to be open enough to know them or recognize them, and if you're so inclined to change them.
Yeah. Is this something, if someone who's listening to this right now is interested, I know I've seen books and such on it, but what do you recommend for someone who wants to learn some minor, social behavior, mannerisms for maybe reading a room or public speaking, where do you think it would be best for them to start? Or should they go to an NLP practitioner? Or is that more for different reasons?
Well, I think you can definitely, scour Amazon for some good books on the topic. Books on NLP, I would tend to rely on people that have a name in the field
Mm,
versus somebody who may not have as well of a knowledge. And you can look at that by looking at the author bios and the reviews of the books. I've read a number of books on NLP from Amazon, and some are great, and some of them were obviously self published.
right.
If you want a great NLP person, you mentioned him already. Tony Robbins is well known for his deep involvement and use of NLP, so he's a great
Mm,
example. When it comes to body language, a lot of great books out there. My suggestion is there's a couple of FBI profilers that have written books on body language.
hmm
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
My advice would be get the ones that give you a large scale overview because you can get like super in the weeds on this. So
Right.
there's some great books. If I can name drop a book, is that okay on the
Yeah,
podcast? There's a
absolutely.
great book called What Everybody is Saying.
I've
And
heard of it.
that's one of my fallback favorites on body language.
Hmm,
So, yeah, I would encourage you to read up. There's some great podcasts on strictly NLP or strictly body language that people can
right.
listen to. And if you really want to learn the basis of conversing and understanding and really relating to people on a deeper level, my suggestion would be to find yourself an NLP practitioner that you're comfortable with and spend some time and invest in some sessions.
hmm Now, Jake, the show's called Learn or Be Learned, so I love to ask this closing question for my guests. What is one life lesson that either you learned from someone or you want the audience to learn from your own life that you'd like to share as a closing point?
The one big lesson that I think I learned way too late in life is if you really want to make an impression on someone, if you really want to become close and well trusted by them, don't talk about yourself at all.
Hmm.
So when you talk to somebody, ask about them, get genuinely interested, understand who they are and what makes them tick. And I will tell you one thing magic that happens. And I was really leery about this when I first heard it because I thought that'll never work. But about 2 or 3 minutes into a conversation with most people, when you're talking strictly about them, there comes a moment where they say, wow, Shiva, I've done a lot of talking about myself. Tell me about you now.
hmm
And that's when they're most receptive.
Hmm.
So I would say if you're ever trying to make an impression, try not to make an impression at all. Just
Right.
listen and focus on them, and the rest will happen by itself.
Right. And I mentioned this too, active listening, where you're actively engaged in what they're
Yeah.
saying, goes a long way to the point where I've had people who have genuinely loved my presence out of the mere fact I just was a good listener,
Yeah.
right? I didn't even really tell much about myself in that interaction. And I noticed that, people are more receptive to having you back. It's almost like you said at the beginning, people to some extent like talking about themselves, which
Of
is
course.
not a positive or negative thing. It's just
No,
how it
it
is.
is
Yeah.
what it is.
hmm Which I love that advice. I think that'd go a long way for the listeners. But anyways, thank you, Jake. Thank you so much for being here and sharing.
Thanks for having me on your show. This was an honor.